Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, was one of the first psychologists to propose a structured theory of female psychology, particularly in relation to childhood development, sexuality, and identity. At a time when women's mental and emotional lives were largely overlooked in scientific discourse, Freud sought to explain how gender differences emerge and shape personality, offering a framework that positioned early childhood experiences and unconscious conflicts as fundamental to psychological development. His theories, though widely debated, introduced female psychology as a legitimate subject of study within psychoanalysis, challenging the prevailing notion that male psychology was universally applicable. However, his views have been extensively criticized, challenged, and reinterpreted over time, with many scholars, particularly feminist psychologists, arguing that Freud's work reflected the gender biases of his era rather than objective scientific observations. His theories were built on an inherently androcentric perspective, often defining female development in contrast to male norms, rather than considering it as an independent process. This approach led Freud to portray women as psychologically incomplete versions of men, reinforcing stereotypes about emotional dependency, passivity, and a lack of autonomy. Many feminist scholars and psychologists contend that his ideas not only reflected but actively contributed to the reinforcement of restrictive gender roles, shaping societal attitudes that persisted for much of the 20th century. Despite these significant flaws, Freud's work played a crucial role in shaping discussions on female psychology, inspiring both criticism and reinterpretation that eventually led to more nuanced, empirical, and socially informed understandings of gender, identity, and psychological development. Freud's broader framework of psychological development was based on his theory of psychosexual stages, which outlined how early childhood experiences shaped adult behavior and identity. According to Freud, individuals progress through 5 key stages: oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital, each marked by a distinct focus of psychological energy. While Freud maintained that these stages applied to both sexes, he argued that biological sex determined how individuals navigated them, ultimately leading to different psychological outcomes for men and women. One of the most controversial aspects of his theory was his application of the Oedipus complex to male and female development. During the phallic stage, ages 3 to 6, Freud posited that boys experience unconscious sexual attraction toward their mothers, and, as a result, view their fathers as rivals for maternal affection. This inner conflict, known as the Oedipus complex, is resolved when the boy repressed his desires and identified with his father, internalizing masculine traits and societal expectations of male behavior. Freud saw this resolution as crucial for the development of a stable male identity, reinforcing the patriarchal family structure where the father is positioned as the dominant authority figure. Freud struggled to construct an equivalent developmental model for girls, and his explanation remained inconsistent and incomplete. He later proposed a parallel but less defined process for female development, which was later termed the Electra complex, though Freud himself was reluctant to fully embrace this concept. Instead, he focused on the idea of penis envy, which he believed was central to the female psychosexual experience. According to Freud, young girls, upon realizing they lack a penis, develop feelings of inferiority, resentment, and psychological loss. He suggested that in response to this realization, girls unconsciously blame their mothers for their castration and seek to resolve this psychological conflict by identifying with their mothers while redirecting their unconscious desire for a penis into a desire for a child. Freud claimed that this process was what facilitated a girl's acceptance of traditional femininity, reinforcing characteristics such as passivity, nurturance, and emotional dependency on men. His framework implied that a successful resolution of this conflict required a woman to embrace motherhood as the fulfillment of her psychological development, reinforcing rigid gender roles that placed women primarily in caregiving roles. Freud's theory of penis envy remains one of the most criticized aspects of his work. Many psychologists and feminists argue that it is androcentric, reductionist, and reflective of outdated gender norms rather than objective psychological truths. Freud's framework assumed that male anatomy was inherently superior and that female identity was shaped by a sense of deficiency rather than a unique and independent psychological trajectory. Critics have pointed out that rather than experiencing penis envy, young girls are more likely to experience frustration due to societal inequalities, particularly the restrictions imposed on their autonomy, education, and career opportunities. This perspective evolved into the concept of social envy, which suggested that women's dissatisfaction was not biologically determined, but rather a reaction to systemic social constraints imposed by patriarchal societies. Modern psychology has largely rejected Freud's assumption that women psychologically define themselves in relation to men, instead emphasizing the profound role of social, cultural, and environmental factors in shaping gender identity, self-esteem, and personal development. Freud's views on female sexuality further reinforced traditional gender norms by suggesting that women's sexual development was passive, indirect, and emotionally driven, in contrast to men's sexuality, which he described as active, assertive, and straightforward. Freud argued that a young girl's first emotional attachment is to her mother, but as she experiences penis envy, she redirects her affection toward her father, seeing him as a substitute for what she lacks. As she matures, Freud believed, this unconscious desire for the father transitions into attraction toward other men, reinforcing the idea that female sexuality is dependent on male desire and external validation. This perspective contributed to entrenched stereotypes that positioned women as submissive, emotionally dependent, and primarily focused on romantic relationships rather than personal ambitions. However, modern psychological research and feminist critiques have strongly challenged these assumptions, arguing that Freud's model of female sexuality was deeply rooted in Victorian-era gender norms, which idealized women as modest, nurturing, and sexually reserved while portraying men as dominant, independent, and sexually assertive. Contemporary research has demonstrated that female sexuality is not inherently passive, but is shaped by a complex interplay of biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors. Many scholars argue that Freud's failure to acknowledge women's own sexual agency, autonomy, and diverse expressions of desire reflects the restrictive social attitudes of his time, rather than any universal psychological truth about female development. Many later psychologists and feminist scholars directly challenged Freud's theories, seeking to replace his androcentric assumptions with more balanced and evidence-based models of gender psychology. One of Freud's most influential critics was Karen Horney, a psychoanalyst who rejected the concept of penis envy and proposed an alternative theory: womb envy. Horney argued that men, rather than women, experience deep-seated psychological envy, specifically envy of women's ability to bear children. She suggested that this unconscious envy could manifest in male-dominated power structures, as men compensate for their inability to create life by asserting control, dominance, and authority over women. Horney's work reframed gender psychology, shifting the focus away from biological deficiencies and toward the social and cultural systems that shape gender identity and power dynamics. Despite extensive criticism, Freud's contributions to female psychology remain historically significant. He was among the first to formally attempt a theory of female psychological development, even if his conclusions were flawed. At a time when mainstream psychology largely ignored women's experiences, Freud's theories at least acknowledged that female psychology was a subject worth studying. His ideas, though often problematic, sparked critical debates that paved the way for more sophisticated, inclusive, and scientifically grounded understandings of gender and identity. Freud's legacy in the study of female psychology is complex and deeply debated. While many of his theories, particularly those concerning penis envy, female passivity, and sexuality, have been discredited, his influence on psychology cannot be denied. His work laid the foundation for psychoanalysis, inspired generations of psychologists, and opened the door for critical discussions about gender and identity. More importantly, the backlash against his theories led to the development of more nuanced and equitable approaches to understanding female psychology. Today, while Freud's original theories are no longer widely accepted in their pure form, they remain an essential part of the history of psychology, serving as both a foundation and a point of departure for modern perspectives on gender, identity, and human development.